Hello, YouTube. Luigi here. As promised a few weeks ago, I'm going to kick off tonight my series on global warming. And tonight's topic will be changes in the jet stream and how it affects the northern latitude countries, northern tier. Most of the landmass is in the northern hemisphere, to tell you the truth. Parts of the skinny parts of Africa and the skinny parts of South America, and Australia, of course, and Antarctica are south of the equator, but the vast majority of the land masses are in the northern hemisphere. Okay, so here we go. Global warming. I used to say global warming. If I were a state employee in Florida, I'd be forbidden to use that term. I'm not even sure they're allowed to say climate change. This is the ultimate denial for a state that the rest of us know has endured several horrific hurricanes in the past 2 years. It took me quite a while to understand that climate change is actually the better term for reasons I'll soon get into. I'm not sure how this issue got to be so politicized, so polarizing, so divisive, but I sense this divisiveness is a uniquely American phenomenon. I don't sense that the peoples of other nations are so divided on this as we are. While we're down here bickering over who or what is responsible for elevated levels of CO2, the atmosphere doesn't give a tinker's damn who put it there. The inexorable laws of atmospheric physics will go on doing what they do whether we like it or not. And by the way, the percentage of Americans who call themselves climate skeptics or climate deniers is at an all-time low and dropping every year. This is not a Republican issue. It's not a Democrat issue. It's neither a conservative nor liberal issue. This is a looming global crisis, a planetary catastrophe which will ultimately threaten each of us and therefore should have long since united each of us to do battle against this common threat. Early in his presidency, Ronald Reagan addressed the General Assembly of the United Nations. In this speech, he speculates on how all the petty differences which divide all the various peoples of the world would disappear if we had to unite our efforts to combat an outside threat, a hostile alien attack on our world. And yet, such a planetary threat is already here, and it's called climate change. So just who am I who dares to speak out on this issue? I'm a sculptor and a semi-retired architect, just an ordinary schmo with a huge curiosity of and appetite for knowledge. I am not a meteorologist, not a climatologist, not a paleoclimatologist, a glaciologist, an oceanographer, an astrophysicist, a geologist, a geophysicist, an evolutionary biologist, or a social scientist. But I have, on my own, spent hundreds and hundreds of hours listening to the presentations and lectures of such people. PhDs all, some of the most brilliant and now quite alarmed minds on the planet. These are real scientists, not unknowledgeable politicians, and yet for some strange reason, many people would rather trust the blatherings of politicians over the scholarly findings of the best scientific minds on the planet. This last in my series list of scientists, the social scientists, might surprise you. When we start seeing the massive migrations of climate refugees all over the world, you'll understand why this group was included. The predicted movements of huge populations in a desperate effort to find arable land, grazing pastures, or even potable water will make the recent Syrian refugee crisis look like a high school prom. But the truth is, we've already seen the beginnings of climate refugees and their effects on the social fabric. Many say that the so-called Arab Spring arose from a revolt stemming from a drought and the lack of grazing and growing land. The same has been said of the Syrian civil war, that this arose for the same reasons, and the starving people revolted against their government. And to some degree, the caravans of people fleeing Central America has also been linked to survival issues relative to climate change. Imagine low-lying Bangladesh with its 163 million people, almost totally destroyed by the next mega typhoon. Where are the survivors going to go? Will those who can still walk knock on India's door and beg for shelter and food? What will India say? In anticipation of this and for their own self-protective reasons, India has already started to build its wall around Bangladesh. This is an actual picture of that wall. Besides, India has no love for Muslims. And what about the 11.3 million people in the Horn of Africa who've been facing a devastating drought and famine, the worst in 60 years? This story is particularly tragic because many of these people were self-sufficient. Listen to their stories. I used to have 400 goats, but now I have 6. All the grazing land is gone and turned to dust. People are literally dropping dead or dying of dehydration, and many others from starvation. Where will these people go? Will they knock on Egypt's door? What will Egypt say? If you don't think such projections are realistic, look at Venezuela in the recent past. The civil war nearly erupted over the lack of food distribution. When people get hungry, people get desperate and angry. As it is, evolutionary biologist Guy McPherson reminds us that the big box grocery stores only stock 3 days of inventory. Should distribution patterns get interrupted, well, you can figure out the rest. Several times throughout the course of this series, you're going to hear the term positive feedback loop. This is where certain conditions lead to a chain of events that ultimately accelerate the propagation of more of the same first condition. The overarching feedback loop here is the hotter it gets, the faster it gets hotter. This is very important. I'll point out feedback loops as this video continues. I might be aware of 5 feedback loops. Evolutionary biologist and professor emeritus Dr. Guy McPherson says there are at least 60. The computer models and projections made not that long ago were unaware of these feedback loops, and that's why most of them severely underestimated the rapid speed of climate change that we now see. McPherson calls this abrupt climate change. Today we know that the old linear projections are obsolete. All today's projections are quite exponential and quite frightening. Okay, this concludes the preamble. So now we're ready to jump into tonight's topic, changes in our once reliable jet stream. Almost all of the now crazy weather patterns we experience in North America, Europe, and northern Russia are due to the strange changes in our once relatively stable jet stream. To understand the changes in our jet stream, you need to understand the concept of albedo and the importance of Arctic sea ice. Are there any Latin scholars out there? The word albedo comes from the Latin root albus, alba, album, which means white. An albino lacks melatonin, and his skin is therefore white. Albino, there's that L-A-L-B again. A Catholic priest wears a white vestment under his chasuble and calls it an alb, A-L-B. In weather, the concept of albedo refers to the lightness of a surface and its ability to reflect solar radiation back into space. Typically, snow and ice have very high albedo. Land and blue ocean water have a much lower albedo. As warmer Arctic air temperatures begin to melt the Arctic Sea, the formerly high albedo white ice turned into low albedo blue ocean water. This darker ocean is now able to absorb much more solar radiation and, in turn, melt even more sea ice. This is another one of those positive feedback loops. The more ice that melts, the less reflective surfaces there are. These reflective surfaces are now replaced with more and more dark, absorptive surfaces, which get warm and melt more and more sea ice. You can see how this works. 2018 was slated to be the first summer where the Arctic Sea was totally ice-free. Although it came very close, it didn't quite happen in 2018 in totality because of a cooler Pacific Ocean, a La Nina. Luxury cruisers are now taking advantage of this open Arctic Sea, offering cruises for a mere $22,000. The shipping lanes from China to Europe now go through this newly opened Northwest Passage, taking 4 weeks off the trip and saving Panama Canal fees. Sounds like a good thing, doesn't it? You know, in the good old days, a high-pressure dome of warmer air, say, below the Arctic Circle, would be drawn to a lower pressure area above the Arctic Circle, and this collision of high and low pressure winds would encounter the spin of the Earth and set up the west to east jet stream. With an occasional minor trough or ridge, the stream ran pretty much in a straight latitudinal line. Because the extensive ice loss in Arctic Ocean and the consequent loss of albedo and the consequent higher warmer water temperatures, the temperature differential between the air on both sides of both south and north of the Arctic Circle, has more equalized. The once higher pressure air is no longer rushing to the lower pressure. It still meets the spin of the Earth, but the stream is now very greatly slowed down. Instead of being west to east in a relatively straight line, the stream has become loopy and moves much, much more slowly. These loops extend wildly north in ridges and dip way south in troughs. If this occurred in, say, April, a rancher in Montana might think, gosh, it's awful hot here for April. It must be global warming. And on the very same day, an orange grower in Florida might say, this frost is threatening my entire orange crop. There's no such thing as global warming. Well, one of these people is right. And because the now loopy jet stream has lost its jets, these troughs and ridges can remain stalled and take much longer to move away. These slow-moving systems are responsible for setting up areas of prolonged drought, and drought areas are very prone to erupting into massive forest fires. Nobody needs to be reminded of the 2018 wildfire season in California, but the truth is, for the same year, it was far worse in British Columbia. My concern here is not just for firefighters. The victims of massive and widespread floods, mudslides, frequent and more intense tornado outbreaks, and more devastating hurricanes could easily outpace the ability of rescuers, first responders, and EMTs to appear on the scene. People without shelter and food, many of them injured, will be forced to fend for themselves. Just because you may have been spared some horrifying event of out-of-control weather up to now doesn't mean you're immune. This planetary crisis will eventually bite us all. So, I hope you can now see the direct relationship between melting Arctic sea ice and the devastating changes to our jet stream. That was tonight's subject. Jet stream and the loss of sea ice. Stay tuned for part 2. If you're a subscriber, you'll get a notification on it. And thank you so much for watching. God bless you. I love you all. Bye-bye.